You drove Dad into another woman's arms. My son Garrett screamed at me across the dining room. My husband Theodore stood right beside his mistress and said nothing. Not one word. Not after 41 years of marriage. Not after everything we'd built together. In a single moment, my husband betrayed me, and my own son chose his side. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg anyone to believe me. I simply smiled, because neither of them knew what I had already found hidden inside Theodore's office. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened next didn't just expose an affair. It destroyed a lie that had been poisoning my family for years. You drove Dad into another woman's arms. Garrett shouted at me across the dining room, while Theodore stood silently behind him, his jaw tight and his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. For a moment, no one moved. Not Garrett, not Theodore, not even me. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the antique clock hanging above the fireplace. The same clock Theodore and I bought during our honeymoon in Vermont 41 years ago, say. I looked at my son carefully, really looked at him. At 38, Garrett had Theodore's height, Theodore's sharp blue eyes, even Theodore's habit of clenching his jaw whenever he was angry. But in that moment, there was something else in his face too. Something colder, something wounded. And for the first time in my life, my own son was looking at me like I was the enemy. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply folded my napkin beside my untouched dinner plate and stood slowly from the table. Camille Royce leaned back in her chair near the kitchen island, one manicured hand wrapped around a wine glass, watching me with that polished expression she always wore around other people. Concerned enough to look innocent, calm enough to look superior. She had perfected that expression. I think Garrett's just emotional, she said softly, though the slight curve of her lips told a different story. This has been hard on everyone. Hard on everyone. The words almost made me laugh, because 2 hours earlier, I had opened Theodore's email by accident while searching for the reservation confirmation for our anniversary trip to Cape Cod. Instead, I found hotel receipts, private messages, photographs, and one sentence I knew I would never forget for the rest of my life. I wish I'd left Lorraine years ago. I moved my gaze toward Theodore. My husband of 41 years refused to look at me. That hurt more than the affair itself. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes I wonder how many other women have sat in silent dining rooms like this one, realizing the people they loved had already left them emotionally long before they walked away physically. The dining room felt unusually cold that night. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted quietly across the backyard, covering the garden Theodore and I had built together when Garrett was still a little boy, chasing fireflies through the grass. The hydrangeas were buried beneath ice now. Bare branches scratched softly against the glass in the wind. Everything looked frozen. Maybe it had been frozen for years. Theodore finally set his whiskey down with a sharp clink. "Garrett," he muttered, "that's enough." But it wasn't really a correction. It was damage control. Garrett ran a hand through his dark hair and looked back at me with disbelief burning in his eyes. "You had no right to go through Dad's emails." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because somehow, in a single hour, the betrayal itself had become less offensive than my discovery of it. "I wasn't searching for your father's secrets," I said quietly. "I was searching for our anniversary reservation." Camille lowered her eyes at exactly the right moment. The performance was flawless. I suddenly understood why Theodore had fallen for her. Camille Royce knew how to become whatever people needed her to be. Around Garrett, she acted nurturing and elegant. Around Theodore, she became youthful admiration wrapped in expensive perfume. And around me, she became patient. Patient enough to wait for my marriage to collapse on its own. Garrett exhaled sharply. Maybe if you hadn't spent years criticizing Dad and making this house miserable, he wouldn't have needed someone else. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because my son believed them. I looked down at the table. The roast I had spent 4 hours preparing sat untouched between us. The candles had nearly burned down to melted pools of wax. Theodore's favorite jazz record still played softly in the next room. Low piano drifting through the house like a ghost. 41 years. And this was how it ended. Not with screaming. Not with broken dishes. But with my son defending the woman who helped destroy our family while my husband sat quietly beside her. Something inside me became very still. I picked up my wine glass carefully, though I had no intention of drinking from it anymore. "Do you love her?" I asked Theodore calmly. Finally, he looked at me. For one brief second, I saw guilt flicker across his face. Then Camille placed her hand lightly against his wrist, and the guilt disappeared. Theodore straightened slightly in his chair. "Lorraine, things haven't been good between us for a long time. Not denial, not apology, just justification." I nodded once, slowly, as though he had simply confirmed something I'd already known. Maybe I had. Maybe women always know. We just learn how to survive beside the truth until the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. Garrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "I'm not going to sit here and watch you blame Dad for being unhappy." I looked at my son one final time that night. Then I noticed something strange. Camille wasn't looking at Theodore. She wasn't even looking at Garrett. Her eyes had drifted toward the hallway leading to Theodore's office, toward the locked drawer where Theodore kept his financial records. And suddenly, beneath all the heartbreak, another feeling began quietly unfolding inside me. Not rage, not grief, suspicion. Because women like Camille Royce rarely destroy families for love alone. I didn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet for sleep, too full of things that no longer felt real. I sat alone in the living room long after. Garrett stormed upstairs, and Camille finally left through the front door wrapped in her cream-colored coat. Theodore disappeared into his office without another word, closing the door softly behind him, like a man avoiding conflict instead of facing the ruins of his marriage. The grandfather clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2, and still I sat there staring at the dying fire in the fireplace, holding the same untouched glass of wine in my hand. Outside, snow continued, falling across the backyard in thick white layers, covering the stone path. Theodore and I used to shovel together every winter. I remembered Garrett at 8 years old, bundled in a red scarf, laughing while Theodore helped him build crooked snowmen near the fence. For years, I thought those memories meant something permanent. Now I wasn't so sure. I'm glad you're still here with me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes the loneliest moments happen while sitting inside a house full of people who already stopped loving each other long ago. Around 3 in the morning, I finally stood and walked slowly through the kitchen. The roast sat cold on the counter. 3 untouched dinner plates remained exactly where we had left them. Camille's lipstick stain still marked the rim of her wine glass, bright red against crystal. I stared at it longer than I should have. Such a small thing, but somehow it felt more intimate than the messages I had found earlier. Women notice details like that. The traces people leave behind when they start feeling too comfortable inside someone else's life. I cleaned the kitchen quietly, moving slowly beneath the soft yellow lights over the counter. The dishwasher hummed in the silence, while the record finally ended in the next room with a low crackle. 41 years of marriage reduced to dirty dishes and silence. By morning, Theodore still hadn't come upstairs. I found him asleep on the leather couch in his office, one arm hanging off the side, half-empty whiskey glass beside him on the desk. The lamp near the bookshelf still glowed dimly against the dark wood walls. For a moment, I simply stood there watching him. This man had once driven 6 hours through a snowstorm just to spend one Christmas Eve with me while we were dating in college. This man had held my hand during 30 hours of labor when Garrett was born. This man used to leave little notes inside my purse before business trips. And now he was sending hotel confirmations to another woman. I quietly pulled the wool blanket from the chair nearby and placed it over him anyway. Some habits survive heartbreak. Theodore stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. I noticed his phone resting near the edge of the desk. Camille's name lit the screen a second later. One new message. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Did she believe you? That was all it said. No guilt, no shame, just strategy. I set the phone back down carefully and walked out before Theodore opened his eyes. Upstairs, Garrett's bedroom door was closed. I paused outside it for a moment, hearing faint movement inside. Probably pacing. Garrett always paced when he was upset. Even as a little boy, he used to wear paths into the carpet whenever something troubled him. I almost knocked. Almost. But what would I even say? That his father wasn't the victim he imagined? That Camille Royce had probably been planning this for much longer than any of us realized? That his mother wasn't the cold-hearted wife he suddenly believed she was? No. People only hear the truths they're emotionally prepared to hear. And Garrett wasn't ready. Not yet. I went downstairs and made coffee as dawn slowly filled the kitchen windows with pale gray light. The house looked beautiful in winter. Cold, elegant, empty. Theodore came downstairs nearly an hour later wearing yesterday's clothes, his face exhausted and older than I remembered. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Lorraine? I kept my eyes on the coffee cup in my hands. You embarrassed Garrett last night, he said quietly. I looked up slowly, not because the words hurt, but because I genuinely couldn't believe them. You cheated on me, I replied calmly. Theodore rubbed his forehead like a tired businessman handling an inconvenient meeting. It's more complicated than that sentence. I think every unfaithful person eventually says those exact words. As though betrayal becomes less painful if explained carefully enough. I gave a small nod. When did it start? He hesitated. Too long, and suddenly I understood something horrible. This wasn't recent. Camille hadn't appeared suddenly in our lives like an accident. She had been slowly entering this house for months. Maybe longer. The charity events, the business dinners, the weekends. Theodore claimed he was golfing with clients. All those little absences I trained myself not to question. Lorraine, Theodore said carefully, I never meant for things to happen this way. There it was again, not regret over hurting me, only regret over consequences. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug to steady them. Does Garrett know how long it's been going on? No, of course not. Because Garrett still believed this affair was born from some tragic unhappiness inside the marriage. He still believed his father had simply fallen out of love. But affairs built on loneliness usually don't come with coordinated text messages and hidden financial conversations. And Camille Royce was not impulsive. Women like her calculated everything. Then Theodore said something that made the entire room suddenly feel smaller. She understands me in ways you stopped trying to years ago. I stared at him, quietly. 41 years together. And somehow this man still believed betrayal began with unmet admiration instead of personal weakness. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry anymore. Not yet. Just tired, deeply tired. But beneath that exhaustion, something colder was beginning to form. Because Theodore thought this was only about love. Garrett thought this was only about marriage. But I had started noticing something neither of them seemed willing to see. Every time Camille entered this house, Her eyes always drifted toward Theodore's office. The rest of that week passed like a performance. None of us wanted to admit we were trapped inside. Theodore acted polite, Garrett acted distant, and I acted as though my entire life hadn't quietly split open at the dinner table 3 nights earlier. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world didn't stop when your heart broke. The mail still arrived every morning. Coffee still brewed. Laundry still needed folding. People still asked polite questions at the grocery store while your marriage slowly rotted beneath the surface. I'm glad you're here with me. Stay until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the hardest part of betrayal isn't the lie itself. It's pretending everything still feels normal afterward. By Friday afternoon, snow covered nearly every inch of the backyard. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching icy wind bend the trees while Theodore prepared for another business dinner upstairs. At least he no longer bothered inventing convincing explanations. That almost felt more insulting. His overdone bag sat near the front door. Black leather, expensive. The same bag I bought him for our 25th anniversary. Funny how objects survive longer than loyalty. Garrett came downstairs, around 5 wearing his navy wool coat and loosened tie, his expression tired from work. He stopped briefly near the island, checking messages on his phone. For a moment, things almost felt normal again. Then he looked at me, and I remembered nothing was normal anymore. You and Dad should talk, he said quietly, without lifting his eyes from the screen. I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel. We already did, Garrett sighed heavily. No, Mom. I mean really talk. Without trying to punish him. There it was again. That assumption that pain automatically became manipulation when it belonged to me. I studied Son carefully. You think I'm punishing your father? I think... Garrett paused. I think both of you stopped loving each other years ago, and nobody wanted to admit it. The words were calmer than his outburst at dinner. But somehow they hurt more, because this wasn't anger anymore. This was belief. I leaned lightly against the counter. Did your father tell you that? Garrett hesitated, just long enough to answer my question without speaking. Very interesting. Theodore had been preparing this narrative long before I discovered the affair. I suddenly realized Garrett hadn't chosen sides in 3 days. His side had already been chosen months ago. Maybe longer. Theodore came downstairs, then adjusting the cuff of his charcoal coat, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and peppermint whiskey. He glanced between us, immediately sensing tension. Everything all right? Garrett nodded too quickly. Yeah, I was just telling Mom you two should figure things out privately. Figure things out. As though this was some ordinary marital disagreement about retirement plans or vacation schedules. Not a months-long affair, involving a woman who watched our financial office like she was studying blueprints. Theodore picked up his overnight bag near the door. I'll be back Sunday afternoon. I looked directly at him. With Camille, Garrett's shoulders tightened instantly. Theodore's expression hardened. I'm not discussing this in front of him. In front of him. As if Garrett were still a child needing protection, instead of a grown man already defending his father's mistress. I gave a quiet nod. Of course! Theodore stared at me another second. Maybe waiting for tears or accusations. But I had started noticing something surprising over the last few days. Silence, unsettled, guilty people, far more than screaming ever could. He left 10 minutes later. The front door closed softly behind him. Then the house became quiet again. Garrett rubbed both hands over his face and exhaled sharply. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I almost laughed. Harder. 41 years of loyalty reduced to an inconvenience. I walked toward the sink and poured the cold coffee down the drain. When did you first meet Camille? I asked calmly. Garrett frowned slightly at the sudden question. At Dad's foundation gala last spring. Last spring. So nearly a year. I kept my expression neutral. She seemed nice, Garrett continued carefully. She listened to Dad. She made him feel appreciated. There it was again. Theodore's version of events repeated, almost word for word, through our son. She works in real estate, right? I asked. Luxury properties, successful? I guess so. Guess, not certainty. Interesting. I turned toward him fully now. Then why is she always asking questions about your father's investments? Garrett blinked. What? The office, the accounts, the trust paperwork. Camille pays attention to those things. That's ridiculous, he snapped immediately. Not everyone is secretly plotting something. No, not everyone. But experienced women notice patterns. And Camille Royce never asked casual questions. Every conversation with her felt carefully placed, measured, like someone gently checking doors to see which ones were unlocked. I remembered a charity dinner 6 months ago when she spent 20 minutes asking Theodore about property taxes on the Connecticut lake house. At the time, I thought she was making polite conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. Garrett grabbed his keys from the counter. You're doing it again. Doing what? Trying to make Dad look like some helpless old man being manipulated. I looked at him quietly. That's not what I said, but that's what you mean. Maybe. Or maybe I simply understood people better than Garrett wanted to believe. My son still viewed betrayal emotionally. Love, loneliness, midlife crisis. But Camille Royce didn't strike me as emotional at all. She struck me as patient. Garrett headed toward the front door before stopping suddenly. Mom! His voice softened slightly for the first time all week. I know this hurts, but maybe this marriage ended a long time ago. I watched snow falling heavily beyond the windows behind him. Maybe he was right. Maybe some marriages died slowly and quietly, years before anyone admitted it aloud. But marriages weren't the only things that could be exploited after decades together. And deep in my chest, a terrible suspicion continued growing stronger with every passing day. Because if Camille truly loved Theodore, why did she seem far more interested in everything Theodore owned? Theodore stayed away for most of the weekend. Not unusual anymore. Years ago, his absence used to worry me. I would call his phone twice, maybe 3 times, imagining car accidents, or icy roads, or sudden illness. Back then, love still made me panic. Now his silence simply left behind an empty space in the house. And strangely enough, I was beginning to prefer the quiet. Saturday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Snow clung heavily to the pine trees lining the driveway, and the entire neighborhood looked frozen beneath a pale winter sky. I wrapped myself in my thick navy cardigan and carried a cup of coffee into Theodore's office for the first time since the affair exploded at dinner. The room still smelled like him. Whiskey, leather, cologne, old paper. For 41 years, this office represented security to me. Theodore built his business inside this room. Late nights, endless contracts, phone calls whispered behind closed doors while Garrett slept upstairs as a child. I used to feel proud whenever I passed by and saw the light beneath the door. Now I wondered how many lies had lived inside this room with us. I'm glad you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive suddenly. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you for years while you continue calling it love. I moved slowly through the office, straightening papers absent-mindedly. Theodore hated disorder. Everything always had its place. The desk drawers were locked, just as they had been for the past few months. At first, I told myself it was probably related to taxes or confidential business paperwork. Now I remembered something else. 3 months ago, Camille had wandered into this office during Thanksgiving dinner, carrying a glass of wine. She smiled when she saw me watching her. I've always loved rooms that feel powerful, she had said casually, while her eyes scanned Theodore's filing cabinets. At the time, the comment barely registered. Now every memory felt different. I sat slowly in Theodore's leather chair and opened the lower cabinet beneath the bookshelf. Mostly old financial folders, insurance documents, property records. Then I noticed a thin black envelope tucked beneath a stack of retirement paperwork, no label, no date, just Theodore's handwriting. Something inside me tightened. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of property transfer drafts. Connecticut Lake House, investment accounts, trust modifications, and Camille Royce's name appeared far too many times beside Theodore's. I stared at the papers for several long seconds before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. Theodore wasn't simply having an affair. He was preparing to move assets, quietly, strategically, without telling me. My hands became cold despite the heat running through the house. 41 years. 41 years helping build his life, raising our son, hosting clients, standing beside him through bankruptcies and recoveries and endless sacrifices. And now another woman's name sat attached to things we built together. I heard footsteps upstairs suddenly and closed the folder immediately. Garrett. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway adjusting the sleeve of his sweater. "Oh," he said, surprised to find me there. "I didn't know you were in Dad's office." I placed the papers calmly back into the envelope. "Just organizing." Garrett nodded awkwardly before stepping farther inside. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward Theodore's desk. "You shouldn't go through his private things." There was anger in his voice this time. "Only exhaustion." I looked at my son quietly. "Do you think your father has secrets from you too?" Garrett frowned immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said softly, but it wasn't nothing. Not anymore. Garrett walked toward the window, overlooking the snowy backyard, shoving both hands into his pockets the way Theodore always did when uncomfortable. "I talked to Dad this morning." "Of course he did. And he said things between you two have been broken for years." I almost smiled sadly at that. Broken for years. Interesting how unhappy men always waited until another woman appeared before finally admitting their marriages were broken. Garrett continued, staring outside. "He said he stayed because he didn't want to hurt you." That one almost impressed me. Not because it was believable, because it was cruelly efficient. Theodore wasn't only protecting himself anymore. He was rewriting history. I folded my hands together carefully to keep them steady. "Did he tell you he's changing financial documents too?" Garrett turned quickly toward me. "What?" I watched his face closely. Confusion. Real confusion. Good. That meant Garrett truly didn't know. I reached for the black envelope slowly and slid one paper halfway out across the desk. Garrett stepped closer. The color drained from his face almost immediately. "What is this?" "A very good question." He grabbed the document faster now, eyes scanning Theodore's signature beside Camille's name. "No," he muttered instantly. "Dad wouldn't." But he stopped speaking halfway through the sentence, because the evidence sat directly in his hands. Signed, dated, real. The room suddenly felt much colder. Garrett looked up at me with uncertainty, breaking through his confidence for the first time since all this began. "I don't understand." Neither did I. Not completely. But one thing had become painfully clear. Camille Royce had not entered our lives by accident. And Theodore had been hiding far more than an affair. Garrett lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me, staring down at the papers like someone seeing his father clearly for the first time. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he asked the question I think he had been avoiding all week.
"How long has this been happening?"
Garrett sat frozen across from me, the property transfer papers trembling slightly in his hands. Outside the office windows, snow continued falling across the backyard in slow, heavy sheets. The world looked soft and quiet beyond the glass, almost peaceful. Inside the room, everything felt like it was cracking apart. I asked you something, Garrett said again, his voice lower now. How long has this been happening? I looked down at Theodore's signature, near the bottom of the documents. Strong, steady, confident. Not the signature of a confused old man manipulated overnight. No, I said softly. The real question is how long has your father been planning this? Garrett leaned back slowly in Theodore's chair, stunned. For the first time since the affair exploded into the open, my son finally looked uncertain instead of defensive. And uncertainty was dangerous. Because once people begin questioning one lie, they often start noticing all the others too. I'm glad you're here with me. Stay until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the hardest part of betrayal isn't discovering the truth. It's realizing how long everyone else has been hiding it from you. Garrett rubbed both hands over his face. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, I replied calmly. You just don't want it to. His eyes lifted toward mine sharply. You think Dad's using Camille for money? I almost laughed at that. No, Garrett. I think Camille is using your father. Silence settled heavily between us, the kind of silence filled with memories rearranging themselves into something uglier. Garrett stared again at the paperwork. She told us she already owned property in Miami. Did she? I mean, he hesitated. That's what she said. Interesting. Interesting. Camille always spoke carefully enough to sound believable, without ever offering details someone could verify. I stood and walked slowly toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. You know what I remember most about her? I asked quietly. Garrett looked up tiredly. What? She never asked personal questions. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means Camille never cared about family. Stories. She didn't ask about your childhood. She didn't ask about Theodore's mother. She barely asked anything about our marriage. I turned toward him slowly. But she always asked about assets. Garrett's expression tightened. I continued calmly. The lake house taxes, Theodore's retirement accounts, investment properties, insurance policies. I paused. That isn't romantic curiosity? No, Garrett snapped suddenly. You're twisting things because you're angry. Maybe, but anger didn't create signed transfer drafts hidden inside locked drawers. Garrett stood abruptly and began pacing the office. Same pattern as when he was little. 3 steps forward, turn, 3 steps back. I don't know what to think anymore. There it was. The first honest thing he'd said in days. I watched him quietly for a moment before speaking again. Did your father ever tell you why Camille divorced her second husband? Garrett stopped pacing immediately. Second husband? I nodded slowly. He told you she was divorced once, didn't he? Yes, she's been divorced twice. The room went silent again. Garrett stared at me. How do you know that? Because women like Camille Royce always leave trails behind them. But I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I walked toward Theodore's desk and opened the lower drawer beside the filing cabinet. Inside sat an old charity gala booklet from last spring. Camille's photo smiled elegantly from the donor page beside a wealthy developer nearly 20 years older than her. I handed it to Garrett. He looked down at the page, then looked back up at me. That's her ex-husband? I believe so. Garrett's face slowly paled. The man in the photo looked remarkably similar to Theodore. Same silver hair, same expensive suits, same wealthy older businessman energy. My son sank back into the chair quietly. No, I said nothing, because deep down, Garrett already knew. People rarely see manipulation while it's happening. But once the pattern appears, it becomes impossible to ignore. She told Dad they met through charity work, Garrett whispered. Maybe they did. The problem wasn't where they met. The problem was how consistently Camille positioned herself around powerful older men with money. Garrett looked physically sick now. Good. Not because I wanted my son hurting. but because reality was finally reaching him. He stared down at the photograph again. Then suddenly, his expression changed. Not anger, recognition. Wait, my chest tightened slightly. What? Garrett looked toward Theodore's locked desk drawer. Last month, Camille asked Dad weird questions about the trust. I stayed very still. What kind of questions? She asked what happened if something happened to you first. The room became completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Garrett swallowed hard. At the time, I thought she was just helping Dad plan retirement stuff. But now he didn't sound convinced anymore. Now he sounded afraid. I sat down slowly across from him. When people show you who they are, I said quietly, you should believe them the first time. Garrett stared at me for several long seconds. Then finally, almost reluctantly, he asked the question neither of us had wanted to face until now. Do you think Dad knows what she's really doing? I thought about Theodore. About the whiskey, the secret hotel trips, the desperate need to feel admired again. Then I remembered the look on Camille's face every time she entered this office. Not emotional, not romantic. Calculating, careful, patient. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something deeply unsettling. Camille Royce might not be the most dangerous person in this story. Because men willing to betray their own families often become willing to betray themselves too. After Garrett left the office, I remained there alone for nearly an hour. The house had become strangely quiet again. Not peaceful quiet, careful quiet, the kind families create when everyone is hiding something different. I sat behind Theodore's desk, staring at the black envelope, still lying open beside the lamp. Snowlight spilled softly through the windows, turning the dark wood office pale gray. Somewhere upstairs, the heater clicked on with a low hum. 41 years. I kept thinking about that number. 41 years of birthdays. Mortgage payments, Christmas morsings, family vacations, late-night hospital visits. Endless ordinary moments stitched together into what I believed was a life built on trust. And now, I was sitting in my husband's office, discovering hidden transfer drafts, like a stranger investigating someone else's marriage. I'm glad you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you all at once. Sometimes it happens slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize the life you trusted no longer exists. I carefully returned the documents exactly where Garrett and I had found them. Same folder. Same angle beneath the retirement records. If Theodore realized we knew about the transfers, he would become cautious. And right now, cautious people were harder to expose. By Sunday evening, Theodore finally returned home. I heard the garage door open just after 6, then footsteps, then silence in the kitchen. I remained upstairs in our bedroom, sitting near the window, with a book open in my lap. I hadn't actually read in nearly an hour. The bedroom still looked like the marriage Garrett imagined we had. Matching lamps, framed vacation photos. The heavy cream-colored comforter Theodore insisted was too expensive to replace. Funny how appearances survive long after intimacy dies. A few minutes later, Theodore entered the room, carrying his overnight bag. He looked tired, older somehow, but not guilty enough. You're upstairs early, he said cautiously. I turned a page calmly. I was reading. Theodore set the bag near the closet and loosened his scarf slowly. I noticed he was studying me carefully now. People become nervous when silence replaces emotional reactions. How's Garrett? He finally asked. There it was. Not, how are you, Garrett? Because Theodore already understood the danger wasn't losing me anymore. It was losing control of the story. He's confused, I answered quietly. Theodore exhaled through his nose and sat heavily at the edge of the bed. This situation is difficult for him. Situation. Such a clean word for betrayal. I closed the book gently in my lap. Did you tell him about the property transfers? Theodore froze. only for a second, but long enough. Slowly, he looked toward me. What transfers? A lie, immediate, instinctive. I watched him carefully. Theodore, I said softly. Please don't insult me by pretending. His shoulders tightened, and suddenly I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Not fear of divorce. Not fear of losing his marriage. Fear of exposure. Theodore stood and walked toward the dresser, keeping his back to me while removing his watch. You went through my office. You hid legal documents connected to another woman. That isn't what this is. I almost smiled. Every liar says that too. Then explain it to me. Theodore stayed silent for several long seconds before finally speaking. Camille has business investments tied into one of the properties. Business investments. Interesting choice of words. Which properties? The Connecticut Lake House. There it was again, the Lake House. Camille seemed deeply interested in that property specifically. I remembered Garrett mentioning her questions about trust structures. Insurance, ownership succession. Not emotional questions, financial ones. I kept my tone calm. And why exactly does your mistress have financial ties to our lake house? Theodore turned sharply then. She's not just my mistress. The words hung heavily between us. Not just. As though that somehow made things better. I looked at him for a long moment, then quietly asked the question I think he feared most. Do you love her? Theodore's expression shifted immediately. Not certainty, not passion, confusion. That told me everything. Men in love answer quickly. Men being manipulated hesitate. She understands me, he muttered eventually. No, that wasn't love. That was ego being fed. I stood slowly from the chair near the window. You're 71 years old, Theodore. Not 25. His eyes hardened immediately. What's that supposed to mean? It means women like Camille Royce don't build futures. They attach themselves to existing ones. Theodore laughed bitterly under his breath. There it is. There what is. The judgment. The superiority. The reason this marriage stopped feeling like home years ago. Interesting. Because men often rewrite women into villains after betraying them. It helps reduce guilt. I walked toward the bathroom doorway slowly. Did Camille tell you to say that? Theodore's silence answered for him. I turned on the bathroom light, then paused. Theodore. He looked up. For your sake, I truly hope you know exactly what you're doing. And for the first time, since this nightmare began, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker across his face, just for a second. But it was enough, because deep down, Theodore Voss was finally beginning to realize something dangerous. If Camille Royce had manipulated him successfully, then she had probably manipulated other men before him too. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For years, I used to sleep deeply beside Theodore. Even during difficult seasons in our marriage, the familiar rhythm of another person breathing nearby had always comforted me somehow. Now the emptiness beside me felt almost relieving. Cold, but honest. I lay still for a few minutes, staring at the pale winter light, filtering through the bedroom curtains. Downstairs, I could hear the coffee machine automatically turning on in the kitchen. Theodore programmed it every night before bed like clockwork. Funny how routines survive even when relationships don't. I'm glad you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes people stop loving each other quietly, long before anyone admits it out loud. The routines remain, the habits remain, but the warmth disappears first. When I finally went downstairs, Theodore was already dressed for the day, standing near the island with his phone pressed to his ear. The moment he saw me, his voice changed. Softer, careful. I'll call you later, he muttered before ending the call immediately. Camille. Of course. Theodore avoided my eyes while pouring coffee into his travel mug. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat awkwardly. I have meetings downtown most of today. I nodded once, no questions. No accusations. Again, the silence unsettled him more than anger ever could. Theodore grabbed his car keys from the counter, but paused near the doorway.
Garrett's coming by tonight.
Interesting. Not Garrett invited us to dinner. Not we're having dinner together. Garrett's coming by. Like our son had suddenly become a mediator instead of family. Did he ask to see me? I asked calmly. Theodore hesitated slightly. He wants us all to talk. Translation: Garrett wanted peace restored before he fully understood how ugly the truth might become. The front door closed a moment later, leaving the house silent again. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat near the fireplace with my phone in my lap for nearly 20 minutes before finally making the call I'd been avoiding. Sylvia Bennett answered on the second ring. Well, she sighed immediately. You sound exhausted. I almost laughed softly at that. After 40 years of friendship, Sylvia could hear emotional collapse in my breathing alone. Can you meet me for lunch? I asked quietly. There was a short pause. Then her voice softened instantly. What happened? By noon, we were sitting inside a small cafe near the river 2 towns over from ours. Snow covered the sidewalks outside, and soft jazz drifted quietly through the restaurant while people warmed their hands around soup bowls and coffee cups. Normal lives, normal conversations. I wondered if anyone around us had any idea how easily families could fracture behind closed doors. Sylvia listened without interrupting while I told her everything. The emails, the affair, Garrett blaming me, the transfer drafts hidden in Theodore's office. When I finally finished speaking, she sat back slowly in her chair with narrowed eyes. That woman is after money. No hesitation, no confusion, just certainty. I stared down into my untouched tea. You sound very sure, because I've seen women like her before. Sylvia lowered her voice slightly. Lorraine, do you remember Charles Whitaker? I frowned faintly. The real estate developer? She nodded. He dated Camille 2 years ago. Something inside me tightened immediately. How do you know that? Because my sister worked at Whitaker's law office. Sylvia leaned closer across the table. Charles transferred a condo into Camille's name 6 months before she left him. The restaurant suddenly felt much colder. And after that? I asked quietly. She disappeared. There it was, a pattern. Not romance, not emotional chaos, a pattern. I thought back to the gala booklet Garrett found. Older, wealthy men, financial access, strategic attachment. My stomach turned slowly. Sylvia studied my face carefully. Theodore has no idea what kind of woman he's dealing with. Does he? I looked out the cafe window at snow falling across the street. No, I admitted softly. I don't think he does. Sylvia sighed heavily. And Garrett? That hurt more. Because Theodore was betraying me. But Garrett was abandoning me emotionally while doing it. He thinks I drove his father away. Sylvia's expression darkened immediately. Oh, Lorraine. I looked down at my wedding ring still resting on my finger. 41 years. Such a long time to spend building loyalty around people capable of rewriting you into the villain. Then, Sylvia asked the question I think I'd been avoiding since all this started. Are you staying? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. This house no longer felt safe emotionally, but leaving quietly while Theodore transferred assets behind my back suddenly seemed dangerously foolish too. I need more information first, I said carefully. Sylvia nodded slowly like she already expected that answer. You're thinking strategically now. Maybe I was. Or survival eventually forces women to become sharper than grief. When lunch ended, Sylvia reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Promise me something. What? Do not underestimate Camille Royce. I almost smiled sadly at that. Too late. I already had. By the time I drove back home that evening, the sky had turned dark gray, with another storm approaching. Garrett's car already sat in the driveway, beside Theodore's black Mercedes. The family meeting had started without me, and somehow, I already knew nothing about tonight would end peacefully. The moment I stepped inside the house, I felt the tension. Not loud tension, not shouting. Worse, the kind wrapped in forced calm voices and unfinished conversations that stop the second someone enters the room. Garrett stood near the fireplace in the living room, with both hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. Theodore sat stiffly on the sofa, whiskey glass untouched beside him on the table. And Camille Royce stood near the dining room archway, wearing a cream turtleneck and soft smile like she belonged there. Like this was her home too. All three of them looked toward me at once. Interesting, because suddenly I understood something very clearly. This meeting had not been Garrett's idea alone. Camille was involved. I'm glad you're still here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who walk into broken families pretending they only want peace. You started without me, I said calmly while removing my gloves. Garrett immediately looked uncomfortable. We weren't really starting anything, he muttered. Camille stepped forward smoothly before Theodore could speak. Lorraine, we were actually worried about you driving in this weather. There it was again, that polished concern, that gentle tone carefully designed to make me appear cold if I rejected it. I placed my purse quietly on the hallway table. How thoughtful. Theodore exhaled heavily. Can we please sit down and talk like adults? Like adults. Interesting phrase coming from a man hiding financial transfers behind his wife's back. Still, I walked into the living room and sat in the armchair near the window. Garrett remained standing. Nervous energy rolled off him in waves. Camille sat beside Theodore slowly, crossing her legs elegantly, while resting one manicured hand against the sofa cushion behind him. Possessive without being obvious. Strategic. Theodore cleared his throat first. Garrett thinks we should handle this privately, before things become uglier, before things become discoverable. That's what he really meant. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. Privately for whose benefit? No one answered immediately. Garrett finally spoke first. Mom, nobody wants to hurt you. I looked at my son for a long moment. You already did. The room went silent. Garrett's face tightened instantly. Good. Some truths should feel uncomfortable. Camille leaned slightly forward then, her expression carefully sympathetic. I know this situation has been painful. You don't know anything about my pain, I interrupted softly. Her lips pressed together briefly. Tiny crack. Very small. But real. Theodore rubbed his forehead with visible frustration. This is exactly why we can't have a civil conversation. Again. My emotional response became the problem instead of his betrayal. Classic. I looked directly at him. You transferred property drafts into another woman's name. Garrett visibly stiffened. Theodore shot him a sharp glance immediately. Interesting. So Theodore still didn't know Garrett had already seen the paperwork. I explained that already, Theodore said carefully. No, I replied calmly. You attempted to explain it. Camille finally spoke again, this time more carefully. Theodore was only trying to make future planning less stressful for everyone. Everyone, not Lorraine, everyone. I studied her face quietly. Beautiful women often underestimate older women because they mistake calmness for weakness. Big mistake. What exactly does my husband's lake house have to do with your future planning? I asked softly. Camille didn't answer right away. Another mistake. People tell the truth fastest when surprised. Instead, Theodore jumped in quickly. The property arrangement was temporary. Temporary. Like affairs. Like lies. Like loyalty, apparently. Garrett suddenly stepped forward then. Dad, stop. The room froze. Theodore looked at him sharply. What? Garrett swallowed hard before speaking again. Just Stop talking to her like she's stupid. Silence crashed heavily across the room. For the first time since all this began, Garrett sounded angry at his father instead of me. Interesting shift. Theodore noticed it too. You don't understand the full situation, he snapped. No, Garrett replied quietly. I don't think I do. Camille's posture changed almost instantly beside him. Subtle. But I noticed. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, because manipulators survive through emotional control. And Garrett was beginning to slip outside the version of events Theodore and Camille, carefully built together. Dangerous, very dangerous for them. Theodore stood abruptly and walked toward the fireplace. This marriage has been over for years. I almost smiled sadly. Funny how cheaters always announce the marriage ended years ago only after they're caught. Then why didn't you leave years ago? I asked. Theodore turned toward me sharply. Because I was trying to protect this family. No, he was trying to protect his image. Big difference. Garrett looked exhausted now, running one hand over his face. Dad, but Theodore kept going. You checked out emotionally a long time ago, Lorraine. Everything became criticism, distance, routine, interesting. Because men often call stability coldness once excitement appears elsewhere. I kept my voice calm. And Camille fixed all that? Theodore hesitated. Again, always hesitation. Meanwhile, Camille sat perfectly still beside him, watching every emotional movement in the room like a chess player studying the board. Then she finally spoke softly. I never intended to come between anyone. Lie, not emotional instinct, calculated lie. Women who accidentally fall into few affairs don't ask detailed questions about trusts and inheritance structures. Garrett suddenly looked toward her, directly, really looking at her for perhaps the first time. When did you and Dad start discussing the trust? There it was, the real question. Camille blinked once. Small pause. Tiny delay. But enough, and in that moment I realized something important. Garrett had finally stopped defending the affair. Now he was starting to investigate it. Theodore noticed the shift too, and for the first time all evening, I saw genuine panic flicker across Camille Royce's face. No one spoke for several seconds after Garrett asked the question. The room felt frozen. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed smaller somehow, its soft orange glow barely warming the cold tension spreading through the house. Camille recovered first. Of course she did. Women like Camille Royce survived by recovering quickly. Theodore mentioned the trust casually once or twice. She answered smoothly, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I work around high-value properties all the time. Financial conversations happen naturally. Natural. Interesting word. Garrett didn't sit back down. He remained standing near the fireplace, staring directly at her now. And I noticed something subtle shifting inside my son. Suspicion. Small still. Fragile. But growing. I'm glad you're still here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the truth enters a family quietly, not through screaming or confessions, but through tiny moments when someone finally notices things that never made sense before. Theodore stepped in immediately. This conversation is getting ridiculous. No. Dangerous. That was the real problem. Because Theodore suddenly realized Garrett was no longer reacting emotionally. He was starting to think logically, and logical people become difficult to manipulate. Garrett crossed his arms tightly. Dad, why would Camille need involvement with the lake house at all? Theodore's jaw tightened. She was helping me organize future investments. Garrett frowned. With ownership drafts? Silence. There it was, again. Another silence that answered more than words could. Camille finally stood slowly from the sofa, her expression softer now, almost wounded. I think maybe I should leave. Classic move. Exit gracefully before pressure increases. But Garrett surprised all of us. No, he said quietly. Camille paused. Garrett looked directly at her. I think you should stay. Interesting. Very interesting. Because my son had finally realized something manipulative people hate most. If someone leaves too early, they control the story afterward. Camille's eyes flickered briefly toward Theodore. Tiny movement, but enough. She wanted guidance. Theodore nodded almost invisibly. Permission granted, and suddenly I understood their dynamic more clearly than ever before. Theodore believed he was leading this situation. But Camille constantly checked emotional temperatures before making moves. She adapted, calculated, adjusted. That wasn't romance. That was strategy. Garrett sat down slowly across from them, leaning forward with both elbows resting on his knees. When exactly did this start? No one answered immediately. Finally, Theodore sighed heavily, like a tired man burdened by difficult truths. About 8 months ago. Lie. I knew it instantly. Not emotionally. Instinctively. Because people rarely choose exact, clean numbers when telling uncomfortable truths. 8 months sounded edited, controlled, safe. Garrett looked toward Camille. And before that? Camille blinked once. What do you mean? You and Dad already knew each other before that. Her expression remained composed, but too composed. Careful people become dangerous when cornered because they focus more on performance than honesty. We met at the foundation gala, she answered smoothly. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah. But Mom said you dated Charles Whitaker before that. There it was. The first real crack. Camille's face changed almost invisibly. Only for half a second. But enough. Theodore immediately turned toward her. You knew Whitaker? Interesting. So even Theodore didn't know everything. Camille recovered quickly. Briefly. Garrett frowned. You never mentioned that. It wasn't important. No, it was extremely important. Because patterns become dangerous once people notice them repeating. Theodore looked uncomfortable now. Not angry. Uncertain. Good. For the first time, he was realizing Camille withheld information from him too. Garrett leaned back slowly, processing everything. Then quietly asked the question none of us expected. How many older men have you dated? The room went completely silent. Camille stared at him in disbelief. Theodore, she said softly, almost offended. Are you really going to let him speak to me like this? Again. Redirection. Avoid answering the actual question by focusing on tone instead. Very skilled. But Garrett noticed it this time too. I asked you a question. Camille's calm expression finally cracked slightly. I don't think my past relationships are any of your business. Garrett laughed once under his breath. Short, sharp. No, he muttered quietly. I think they might be exactly our business. Theodore stood abruptly. That's enough. But it was too late. The emotional balance inside the room had shifted. Garrett was no longer defending his father's affair. Now he was examining it. Huge difference. I sat quietly watching all of them. Amazing how quickly certainty collapses once people begin asking practical questions instead of emotional ones. Camille looked toward Theodore again. Not romantic, not loving, nervous, because Theodore was supposed to remain emotionally useful, not suspicious. And suddenly I realized something almost sad. Camille Royce had probably underestimated Garrett completely. She assumed he would remain angry at me long enough to never question her motives. But grief fades, shock settles, and eventually even loyal sons begin noticing inconsistencies. Garrett stood again and walked slowly toward the window, overlooking the snow-covered driveway. I defended you, he said quietly without turning around. No one answered. Garrett laughed bitterly under his breath. I blamed Mom. That one hurt. Not because he said it. Because he finally understood it himself. Theodore stepped toward him carefully. Garrett, no. Garrett shook his head immediately. I need you to answer honestly for once. Theodore froze. My son turned around slowly. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Garrett looked directly at his father, not like a son seeking reassurance, but like a man trying to determine whether he could still trust him at all. Then he asked quietly, "Did you ever actually plan to leave, Mom? Or were you just planning to move the money first?" Theodore didn't answer Garrett's question right away. And honestly, that silence told us everything. The fire crackled softly in the living room, while snow continued falling outside the tall windows. Somewhere upstairs, the old heating pipes groaned through the walls. The entire house suddenly felt tired, worn down, like the truth itself had exhausted it. Garrett stared at his father, waiting for an answer. A real one this time. Not another polished excuse. Not another carefully edited version of events. Theodore finally exhaled heavily and rubbed one hand across his mouth. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Garrett laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. "That's not what I asked." Camille shifted beside the sofa, crossing her arms tightly now. For the first time all evening, she no longer looked calm. Good, because manipulative people rely heavily on emotional control. Once the atmosphere becomes unpredictable, they start losing their footing. "I'm glad you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from." Sometimes families don't fall apart in one explosive moment. Sometimes they collapse slowly. The second people finally stop accepting half-truths. Garrett looked directly at Theodore again. "Were you planning to leave Mom before moving assets into Camille's name?" Theodore's expression hardened immediately. "You're making this sound criminal." Interesting choice of words. Not wrong, not unfair, criminal. Garrett noticed too. That's not an answer. Theodore grabbed his whiskey glass from the table but didn't drink from it. His hand trembled slightly against the crystal. Tiny detail, but I saw it. Men like Theodore hated losing authority inside a room. And for the first time in decades, he no longer controlled the narrative. "I was trying to protect everyone financially," he muttered. Everyone. Again. Such a convenient word when betraying one specific person. Garrett shook his head slowly. "See. You were hiding property drafts from Mom. It was temporary. There's that word again." Camille suddenly stood from the sofa. "Theodore, this is becoming unfair. Unfair. Interesting. Not painful. Not emotional. Unfair." Because Camille's great concern was no longer morality. It was exposure. Garrett turned toward her immediately. "How much did you know about the transfers?" Camille blinked slowly. "Theodore handles his own finances." Deflection. Garrett caught it instantly now. "That wasn't my question." The room fell silent again. Camille looked toward Theodore carefully, almost cautiously. And suddenly, something clicked inside my mind. She expected Theodore to rescue her socially, the same way he probably rescued her financially. That dynamic had existed long before I discovered the affair. Theodore stepped forward protectively. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because this situation is between your mother and me." "No, not anymore. Once financial manipulation enters betrayal, the affair stops being private. It becomes strategic." Garrett looked exhausted now, older somehow, like the image he built of his father was collapsing faster than he could emotionally process. Then quietly, he asked the question that changed everything. "Dad, did you ever tell Camille about the trust before the affair started?" Theodore froze. Tiny pause. Half a second. Enough. Garrett noticed. I noticed. Even Camille noticed. And that frightened her. Because suddenly Theodore wasn't only exposing her secrets, he was exposing his own. "You knew her before the gala," Garrett said slowly. Not a question. A realization. Theodore set his whiskey down harder this time. "I met her through an investment dinner." "When?" Silence. Another silence. Garrett stared at him in disbelief. "How long?" "About a year before the gala." The room seemed to shrink around us. Even Camille closed her eyes briefly. Interesting. So, she never expected Theodore to admit that. Garrett looked physically sick now. You knew her for almost 2 years? Theodore looked frustrated. It wasn't serious at first. Again, careful wording. Not nothing happened. Not we were only friends. Just not serious. Garrett laughed bitterly under his breath and stepped away from all of us toward the dining room. I watched my son carefully. This was the moment children realize their parents are capable of becoming strangers. It changes something permanent inside them. He stopped near the dining table where this nightmare first exploded, days earlier. The untouched family photographs still lined the nearby shelves. Christmas mornings, beach vacations, graduation dinners, years of smiling faces frozen inside frames, while the real family quietly fractured underneath them. Garrett picked up one framed picture slowly, a lake house photo from 6 summers ago. Theodore with one arm around me, Garrett beside us laughing, Harper holding sparklers near the dock. We looked happy. Maybe we were, or maybe families always look happier in photographs because pictures never capture silence properly. Garrett stared at the photo for several seconds before finally speaking again. You let me blame Mom. Theodore looked away immediately. That answer hurt Garrett more than the affair itself. Because betrayal from a spouse destroys trust. But betrayal from a parent destroys identity. Camille stepped forward carefully. Garrett, your father never wanted you involved in this. Wrong thing to say. Garrett turned sharply toward her. Then why were you discussing trusts and ownership before he even left his marriage? Camille opened her mouth, closed it. No answer. Because there wasn't a clean answer anymore. Only motives. Theodore suddenly looked tired. Truly tired. Not like a man passionately in love. Like a man realizing he built a fantasy around someone he never fully understood. And for the first time since all this started, I almost pitied him. Almost. Then Garrett looked at me, really looked at me, and quietly asked the question I think had been haunting him all week. Mom, how long did you know something was wrong before all this happened? I thought about the late-night meetings, the emotional distance, the locked office drawers, the way Camille studied financial conversations more closely than family memories. Then I answered honestly. I think part of me knew long before I was ready to admit it. Garrett lowered his eyes slowly. And in that moment, my son finally understood something devastating. The affair hadn't destroyed our family overnight. It had been quietly poisoning us for years. After Garrett's question, no one spoke for a long time. The living room had become unbearably quiet. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because too much had already been revealed. Theodore stood near the fireplace, staring down at the glass in his hand, like he no longer recognized the man holding it. Camille remained motionless beside the sofa, her calm expression slipping further. Each minute, Garrett continued questioning her. And my son looked heartbroken. That was the hardest part. Not Theodore's affair, not even the financial betrayal. It was watching Garrett slowly realize the father he admired had manipulated him too. I'm glad you're still here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes betrayal spreads through a family quietly, like cracks moving through glass. By the time everyone finally sees the damage, it's already everywhere. Garrett sat heavily on the edge of the dining chair and rubbed both hands over his faces. When did this stop being about love? He asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Because, deep down, all of us already knew the truth. This had probably never been about love at all. Camille finally broke the silence first. Theodore and I care about each other. Care. Interesting choice of word. Not love. Not future. Care. Garrett looked up sharply. Then why were there property transfers? Camille's shoulders stiffened again. Theodore wanted to help me. Again. Passive wording. As though Theodore acted alone while she simply stood nearby, innocently accepting expensive generosity. I watched her carefully. People reveal themselves most clearly when pressure forces them to defend their motives. Garrett noticed it too. How exactly was he helping you? He asked. Camille hesitated. Too long. Theodore stepped in quickly. She was going through financial difficulties. There it was, finally. The first honest thing anyone had admitted all evening. Camille turned toward Theodore immediately, panic flashing across her face. Small, but unmistakable. Interesting. She hadn't wanted Garrett hearing that part. Garrett stared at her in disbelief. You told Dad you were broke? I never said broke. Camille snapped suddenly before catching herself. Tiny crack, but enough. Garrett slowly stood again. So Mom was right. Camille folded her arms tightly. You're oversimplifying things. No, Garrett replied quietly. I think I've been oversimplifying them this entire time. Theodore looked exhausted now. Garrett, enough. But my son shook his head immediately. No, I defended you. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. That pain in his face nearly broke me. Because Garrett wasn't only grieving the affair anymore. He was grieving the loss of the father he thought he knew. I blamed Mom, he whispered. Theodore looked away. Again. Always away. Never directly at the damage he caused. Garrett laughed bitterly under his breath. She spent days thinking she ruined your life, while you were hiding financial transfers with another woman. Theodore slammed the whiskey glass onto the table hard enough to make Camille jump. I said enough. The room froze. But Garrett didn't back down this time. Interesting how quickly fear disappears once people stop idealizing you. You don't get to yell right now, Garrett said quietly. Theodore stared at him in disbelief. Maybe because this was the first time his son had truly challenged him as another man, instead of obeying him as a child. Camille stepped forward carefully. Garrett, your father has been under enormous emotional pressure. My mother buried herself emotionally trying to protect this family, he interrupted sharply. Where was everybody's concern for her? Silence, heavy silence, the kind that exposes guilt instantly. I looked down at my wedding ring, still resting on my hand. 41 years. And somehow, the only person finally defending me was the son who accused me days earlier. Life can be strange like that. Garrett turned toward me slowly. Mom, I lifted my eyes to his. Real regret sat there now. Not confusion, not defensiveness. Regret. I'm sorry. Simple words. Quiet words, but genuine. And some of the sincerity hurt more than the cruelty before it. Because Garrett truly hadn't understood what was happening until now. I gave him a small nod. That matters to me more than you know. Camille suddenly looked uncomfortable again. Not emotional discomfort. Strategic discomfort. Because emotional reconciliation between Garrett and me weakened her position as inside the room dramatically. Theodore noticed too. Garrett, he muttered carefully. Relationships are complicated. No, manipulation complicated things. Lies complicated things. Affairs become surprisingly simple once stripped of excuses. Garrett shook his head slowly. You know what's crazy? He asked quietly. I spent this whole week thinking Mom drove you away. He looked directly at Theodore. But now I think you were already halfway out the door, long before Camille showed up. Theodore said nothing, which confirmed everything. Garrett turned toward Camille again. And you knew exactly what kind of man you were attaching yourself to. Camille's face hardened instantly. There's no reason to insult me. No? Garrett laughed softly. You walked into my parents' marriage while discussing trusts and property transfers, before Dad even left the house. Camille opened her mouth again, closed it, nothing left to defend. Because facts eventually corner people more effectively than emotions ever can. The storm outside had grown heavier now. Snow struck softly against the windows, while darkness swallowed the backyard completely. For a moment, all four of us simply stood there surrounded by the wreckage of a family. none of us fully recognized anymore. Then Theodore quietly asked the question I think frightened him most. What happens now? I looked at him calmly, at the man I built my entire adult life beside, at the father of my child, at the stranger standing in my living room. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I already knew my answer, because grief had finally finished turning into clarity. Theodore's question stayed in the room long after he asked it. What happens now? Outside, snow covered the backyard in thick white silence. The garden lights glowed faintly beneath the storm, illuminating the stone path. Theodore and I once walked together every summer evening after dinner. I used to think those quiet walks meant we would grow old side by side no matter what happened. But growing old beside someone and truly knowing them are not always the same thing. I'm glad you stayed with me until the end. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes life doesn't break your heart all at once. Sometimes it slowly removes the illusions you spent years protecting until all that remains is the truth. No one moved. Garrett stood near the dining table, staring at his father, like he was trying to recognize him again. Camille remained perfectly still beside the sofa, though I could see tension pulling at the corners of her expression now. Theodore looked exhausted. For the first time in decades, he no longer looked powerful inside this house. He looked afraid. I folded my hands quietly in my lap before finally answering. What happens now, I said softly, is honesty. Theodore lowered his eyes immediately. Interesting. Because people who spend years controlling narratives usually fear honesty more than consequences. Garrett walked slowly toward the fireplace, shaking his head under his breath. All this time, he muttered quietly, you let me believe Mom pushed you away. Theodore exhaled heavily. I never wanted you involved. No, Garrett replied. You just wanted me emotionally loyal. That one landed hard. Even Camille looked down, because Garrett finally understood. The real betrayal wasn't only the affair. It was manipulation. Theodore had quietly shaped the story long before the truth surfaced. Little comments, distance, carefully planted frustrations. Enough to make Garrett see his mother as cold, while Theodore positioned himself as emotionally abandoned. Classic strategy. And now it had collapsed. Theodore sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa, suddenly looking every bit of his 71 years. I made mistakes, he admitted quietly. Mistakes. Funny word for months of deception, hidden financial transfers, and dismantling a marriage behind closed doors. But I was too tired for anger now. Somewhere over the last week, grief had changed shape inside me. It no longer felt sharp, only clear. Camille finally spoke again, though her voice sounded far less confident than before. Lorraine, I never wanted to destroy your family. I looked at her calmly. No, I said softly. You just didn't care if it survived. Silence, because that was the truth. Women, like Camille, rarely entered stable families accidentally. They entered fractured spaces and widened the cracks already there. Theodore rubbed both hands over his face. Slowly. For 41 years, I would have answered that question immediately. Fight for us. Stay. Fix this. But something inside me had finally become still. I removed my wedding ring carefully and held it in my palm for a moment. A small circle of gold. 41 years condensed into something that suddenly felt strangely light. Then, I placed it gently on the coffee table between us. Garrett looked down sharply. Theodore went pale, and somehow that quiet gesture hurt him more than screaming ever could have. I want peace, I said quietly. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Just peace. Theodore stared at the ring for several long seconds before whispering my name. Lorraine. But there was nothing left to explain anymore. The marriage Garrett believed in had already been dying for years. The affair simply exposed the body. Garrett walked toward me slowly. Then, his eyes filled with guilt, I knew he would carry for a long time. I should have listened to you, he said quietly. I reached for his hand gently. No, I answered softly. You should have listened to yourself sooner. Tears filled his eyes instantly, not dramatic tears. The kind grown men fight desperately to hide. I hurt you. Yes, I admitted honestly. Garrett nodded slowly like he deserved that answer. Maybe he did. But he was still my son, and despite everything, I could finally see something important again, beneath all the confusion and anger. He wasn't cruel. He was manipulated. There's a difference. Camille quietly picked up her coat from the chair nearby. No dramatic speech. No final argument. Just a woman, realizing the future she calculated so carefully, was beginning to collapse around her. Before leaving, she looked once toward Theodore, waiting, perhaps hoping he would follow her immediately. But Theodore didn't move. Interesting, because fantasies often lose their shine the moment consequences become real. The front door closed softly behind her a few seconds later, and suddenly the house felt quieter than it had all week. Garrett sat beside me, while Theodore remained motionless, near the fireplace staring at the wedding ring on the table like it belonged to another lifetime. Maybe it did. The storm outside finally began slowing sometime after midnight. Large snowflakes drifted gently across the backyard, beneath the pale glow of the garden lights. Beautiful, cold, still. A little before going upstairs, Garrett stopped beside me one last time. Mom? I looked up. I don't think Dad knows who he is anymore. Neither did I. But strangely enough, I was finally beginning to remember who I was. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. Looking back now, I realize betrayal rarely begins with one affair or one cruel decision. It begins the moment people stop valuing the loyalty quietly holding their family together. Theodore lost himself chasing admiration. And Garrett almost lost himself believing the loudest version of the story instead of the truest one. But I learned something important through all of it. Growing older does not make a woman weak, invisible, or easy to replace. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who sees everything most clearly in the end.